Recording is on.
Yeah, so hi everyone. This is the Ruby Developer Book Club, and today we are going to cover chapter 7, which is basically about a few guidelines to keep in mind when you're designing your library. And another thing to note is that chapter 7 ushers us into the second part of the book, which includes some other chapters, I think up to chapter 14, as you can see on my screen. So today we'll just be covering one chapter, which is chapter 7, and that is about designing your library. So for the topics we'll cover, we'll look at why you should focus on user experience, and then how to determine the appropriate size for your library, and then handling complexity trade-offs during method design. And here we'll just ask ourselves whether it's better to have many methods as opposed to fewer methods, and we'll be looking at it from that point of view. Yeah. So the chapter starts off with focusing on user experience, and then the author states here that it's very important to simplify the usage of your library as much as possible, because the easier it is to use your library, the more people are going to be drawn to it, and the more people are going to try it out. And the more people that try it out, of course, the more popular your library is going to be. So he starts off with some things to take note of before you even start writing the code for your library. And one of those things is naming your library. And here he states that it's important to check to perform a search on rubygems.org first and see whether the name you're targeting is available for you to use, or if it's already taken. So in the event that you choose a name that is already taken and is already used by another library, regardless of that library's popularity, you won't be able to use that name, because of course the other library already took the name on Ruby Gem. So you'll have to rename your gem. And he talks about a situation whereby you're already done writing the code and you had selected a given name, but then you go and perform the search and the name is already taken. So all instances in your code where that taken name appears, you'll have to replace it with another new name that is available on rubygems.org. And for that section, he talks about mostly renaming if you find out that the name is already taken. And then he talks about some naming conventions. For example, when you're writing a library that depends on some other library, and he says that the convention is library name underscore name, and then I think that's a dash, and then your extension name. So you basically have the name of the library that your library is depending on, and then the extension name is meant to reflect what your library is meant to do. So he gives an example whereby if you're writing a library that adds a testing component to the rack gem, then you're going to name it in such a way that you have rack dash test. So rack is the name of the library your library is depending on. In this case, rack test is depending on rack. And then test, which is seen as the last part of the name, is made to reflect to the user of the gem that this library adds a testing component to the rack gem. And then he mentions that this convention is not always followed by other people that have written libraries, but it's a good idea to follow it. And this leads us to the second thing to look out for, which is having usage examples for your library. So here, if the library is popular, then you're definitely going to have a website for that library. And he advises that on the index page of that library, you should have some usage examples to show a potential user what the library does, and some examples that show you playing around with the library and what the user can uh, can achieve with that library. And then in the event that the library is not as popular and you don't have a website dedicated to the library, then in that case, you're going to have to default to the README file, in which case the usage examples will appear in the README file. So he recommends that at the top of the README file, you'll have a paragraph describing the library, what it does, maybe some of the dependencies. And then right after that information, right after displaying that to the user, you're going to follow that with the usage examples. And yeah, that's that. So moving on, he talks about now interfaces. And the key point he's trying to make here is that the interface should be as simple as possible for the end user of the library. And then he gives an example of designing an interface whereby you're implementing a method that probably conflicts with some other method in a core class. And here it says you're writing a library that creates CSV output from an enumerable such as an array or a hash. So the simplest possible interface is this, whereby you have an array and then you call the to underscore CSV method on that array, and then it returns you the CSV output. But then he asks, is this the best interface? And then he says, that depends. And he gives some reasons for that answer, including that many Ruby programmers are fine with libraries that modify the core classes. And then if you're also fine with a library that modifies the core classes, then the interface he just demonstrated, the one which uses the to underscore CSV method, is the best interface. And another thing to also note is that it's incredibly simple, in that you just call the method on the array that you want to transform. So now on to the downsides of that simple interface, the one that uses the to underscore CSV method. And one major thing to note is that you already have a to underscore CSV method, which is part of the array class. And because it's part of a core class, that method will take precedence over your to underscore CSV method, which is defined as part of enumerable. And another thing to also note is that these two methods, regardless of their similarity in the name, they perform different functions compared to one another. So now he gives a situation whereby modifying the core classes is not considered acceptable, in which case we are going to have to come up with another interface. So here we have a class, and the class is called toCSV. So we create a new instance of the class, we pass in the array we want to convert to CSV output, and then at the very end we call a CSV method on that instance. And one thing to note here is that you're creating a new instance of a class called toCSV, and then after creating that instance, you're now calling a method on that instance. So in short, we are performing two method calls instead of one like we were doing before. So the next iterations of that code are meant to do away with that two method call. So we want to be able to call just one method. And here he introduces the concept of defining a singleton method on the toCSV class, which is called CSV lowercase. And for this method, it's going to take in the array that you want to convert to CSV outputs as an argument. So you can see that in this case, we only have one method call, which is that .csv, and then we pass in the array we want, which is kind of similar to what we had before, whereby we were only calling one method, and that was the to underscore CSV method. So he mentions that this kind of syntax is known to very straightforward for most Ruby programmers, or at least it's known as popular compared to the one which uses the square brackets. So he refactors the very first line of code we looked at to use the square brackets instead, as opposed to using to calling the method and then passing in the array as the argument. So now we move on to two questions. From a user's perspective, there are two main questions a user tends to ask themselves when they're using a library. One of them is, how difficult is it for me to do it myself? And the second one is, how easy would it be if I used a library? So he says that you have no ability to affect the answer to the first question, which is, how difficult is it for me to do it myself? But you can affect the second question, and you can affect it in a positive way by making your library very easy to use and very intuitive to the user in terms of the interface. And then he quotes here that the best libraries are the libraries that make it possible to do something that would be very difficult for the user to do themselves, but make it very easy for the user to accomplish what they want. And yeah, that is the very first part of the chapter. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts or suggestions.
Yeah, I have a bunch, but let me see which ones are. I'm going to take a quick look to see which ones are worth mentioning. I guess one thing I was curious about, and this is something I wasn't familiar with until we read the last book, Ruby Under a Microscope. There was the concept of refinements, which seemed like a way to potentially to extend core classes without causing, global collisions and stuff. But it didn't seem like it was mentioned on page 187. So I was just kind of curious about that. I'm actually curious if the author thinks that refinements are not a good solution to that type of problem, or why they're not mentioned. Then I also took a note on the same page about a technique that I've used, and I don't like doing this, which is why I want to look into refinements. But sometimes if I am putting a method on a core class, which I generally avoid, but in cases where I'll do it, I'll prefix it with the name of the library. So like in this example, he has like 2CSV, or he has, I can't remember, I think the method was called 2CSV. Yeah, and he puts that somewhere, or it was .csv, I can't remember. So it's like, if the library were called, I can't think of a name, but let's just say that the library is called Newton. One solution could be to prefix it with like Newton _2 _CSV, which is kind of ugly because now the method is prefixed, but the chances of collision go way down. So I'd just kind of be curious what the author's thoughts on that approach are. I took another note, which was some things that I don't like when I've extended core classes and then you wind up making the list of methods on the objects longer, which makes it harder sometimes when you're introspecting to find like the method you're looking for. So it's just like a random consideration I have that I took a note of. And then one last thing that the author doesn't mention, there's an approach, and this is a little bit more of an older approach, but you can also define a method that has the same name as the class. So you have 2CSV there, and he did the approach of doing dot parentheses to dot call. But another thing you could actually do is you could actually just define a method called 2CSV and pass it those arguments. So that's kind of an old school Ruby approach of doing things. I think the author has a preference to make use of the square brackets for something like that. But yeah, so I just kind of pointed that out, that you can have a method and a class with the exact same name, and Ruby knows which one you're referring to from the context. But I didn't see that mentioned in the book, so I'm kind of curious what the author's opinion is of that approach. Yeah,
Sorry,
so that's a lot. That's a lot there, but those are probably my more interesting thoughts.
hey Miles, could you please repeat how do you call the last one that you talked about, where you can name the method the same name as the class? Yeah, how
Yeah,
would you call it?
let me just try sharing my screen real quick, although maybe this won't work well. Am I sharing my screen?
No, not yet.
Oh, wait, here we go. Here we go. I have to give it permission.
Okay.
Is it sharing?
Yeah, I can see.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
it is. Okay. So if I just go, oh, I need to make this bigger, don't I? Let's see. So here I am in IRB. I could just do like class A, right? And I could do a.new dot, well, whatever, just a.new. I can also do def A and do this. And so I can do a.new or I can do A. So that's what I was referring to. You just call it.
Oh, okay.
So what I was saying is that the author could do class to CSV and could do df to CSV data, and then could do to CSV data, whatever this would be, and it'll call it. One thing I'm wondering, can I do this without parentheses? I'm just going to try this real quick. Yeah, you can even call it without parentheses. So this was a little bit more common in the early days of Ruby. I don't see this approach as often. It seems like, and what I was saying is, it seems like the author prefers to do something like this when there's like a super convenient thing you want to do with a class and you want to like shorten the invocation. He tends to like to override this. What I don't know is, can I pass a block to this? Sorry, this is like, off topic. Yeah, I can't pass. So one thing I do like about this approach is you could pass a block to it if you wanted to. But anyway, that's an approach that, sometimes I write the code to do this and then I don't use it very often, and then I wind up deleting it if I'm not using it. But yeah, that was it.
I see.
I'll stop sharing. Yeah.
So was that an instance? Was that method an instance method of that class, or?
It'd be an instance method of the root object, because I just defined it at the top level. It's the same as any other method. There's no difference between it. It's exactly like a regular method.
Yeah, except
it's just that the Ruby.
capitalized.
Yeah, it's capitalized, but Ruby allows that. You can capitalize a method if you want to. Yeah.
That's interesting.
It's I don't know, my spidey sense is tingling there, and I don't know exactly why. It's just that, it's not common these days to see that. I would expect, if I were reading the code, oh, there's a capital here, this must be a class and not some method. And so it would be, when I went looking for where it was defined, I tried to look for a file name with that class, but then get lost because it's not a class; it's a method somewhere.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I feel the same way. I think also the dot with the parentheses is pretty uncommon as well. So if I hadn't seen that approach you see there with the dot at the very bottom of the page, Newton's sharing right there, since that's also kind of uncommon, it made me think of the other approaches to this problem. So I just figured I'd mention it. But yeah, I would agree. I think that's one reason that I think I introduce it, Nelson, and then I like using it, but then it's like one of those things that I think you've mentioned before, where you spend more time reading the code than writing it. It's like at a certain point, the speed up of being able to write the faster, it is kind of not worth the consistency and the the non-surprisingness of it. So yeah. So to be clear, I wasn't advocating that folks do that necessarily. I just was kind of surprised it wasn't mentioned.
I have
Yeah, cool.
I have a more general question about this section, and a lot of this is in the context of designing your library. It's right at the top. Um, so he points out that you have to be careful when you're redefining methods on uh, fundamental library classes, and that as a library author, you can fundamentally change how array works by adding methods to it, um, but it might conflict with the users of your library. As you get further on down the chain, like as the user of the library, there are fewer uh, there's less danger in overriding these fundamental libraries. But at some point, when your code gets very, very large, it is kind of nice to start extracting some of this behavior into gems of their own. And so for me, I'm sort of conflicted about, like, well, I don't know when I should be or like how when I should be overriding these fundamental libraries, because maybe later on down the line I'm going to extract this into some sort of gem or some sort of other library for reuse, and maybe I don't want to have the users of my library have surprising moments about when libraries conflict because I've overridden something. But
Yeah, I
maybe
do have a thought on. Oh, go ahead.
but maybe I'm like overthinking it, and it's just okay that to make these choices at the moment and change them later on down the line.
Yeah, I think there's two things there. One is like the pain of changing stuff if you don't like the original design, and then the other is, in general, is it okay to extend the core classes? I think if the point of the like if like a design, I think like the question there is to make, or I think the answer there to some extent is to make clear decision at some point, preferably early on, if the library does that or not, and to communicate that. So the most popular library that does this is Active Support, and Active Support is so popular that there's a lot of Ruby programmers out there that when they drop into an IRB console, they're shocked that something is missing because they had no clue that it was Active Support and not standard library. And so it's weird because you can almost get to the point where now people are so used to the library that they can't even tell the difference between the core extensions and the actual standard library. The author wrote SQL or SQL. I think he actually. I should ask him that. My friends all pronounce it SQL, which is a weird pronunciation to me, but I'm curious how the author pronounces it. That library extends core classes like crazy, and I'm assuming on top of that, it's also compatible with Active Support. But I think like one rule I normally would have would be to try to only include one library that extends core classes. So like Active Support. In the case of using SQL, it's probably fine because it's almost certainly guaranteed to be compatible with Active Support. So if you wanted to do SQL and Active Support, that would probably be fine. But then I think I would no longer want to introduce yet another library on top of that that extends core classes. In reality, I still would like unintentionally do it, but just kind of as a rule, it's certainly not something you should be doing willy-nilly. You shouldn't just willy-nilly being extending core classes. But if the design decision is this library for programmer joy extends core classes, then I think that's fine. But you are making a decision that it might be incompatible with certain other libraries at that point. And that's why I'm curious about refinements, because it feels like the refinements to some extent give you a way to like sandbox it and opt into it. where you want, and I don't know if that helps or not. So I'm kind of curious if refinements is actually a legit solution to this problem, and if it is, like, why I never see anyone using it.
Hey, Nelson, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
So maybe what I have is more of a question, but why 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 doesn't he prefer the the approach that involves having two method calls? Why does he end up factoring it to the point that he only wants to call one method? And also, why is it that the only method he wants to call ends up being a singleton method and not maybe like a regular method?
I mean,
Well, I think it's I think it's subjective, but I would agree that, one method call is better than two, especially if it's like self-explanatory. So yeah, I mean, I think it's subjective, but the subjective decisions he's expressing seem kind of common to me.
yeah, I
Okay.
mean, I think it's a great way to, if it's really one use case here and all you're doing is one thing, then I don't really want to make a new 2CSV instance object just to be able to call one method on it. It's nice to be able to just call just one, just have one call that I can do anywhere and not have to worry about holding a reference to the 2CSV object. Now, if there were multiple methods that I needed to call on it, well, then it makes a lot more sense to create a new 2CSV object and call multiple methods. But it doesn't seem like I need to do that, or that's not the point of this. So it's really nice to just be able to just use it.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. I like the .csv method as well compared to the other ones, the other two.
The other approaches.
Yeah, he's kind of going for simplicity, or mentioned simplicity somewhere in the chapter, and it feels more simple to me to just have one method call, unless it's the use case that Nelson mentioned, where I really do want to hold on to an instance and call different methods at different times. Then it makes a lot more sense to go with the two method approach.
Yeah, true.
I would want to admit that I have never seen this syntax. The syntax on these very last two approaches, I'd never seen this. And the fact that he says that apparently this is like a way of calling a singleton method, I've never seen this. The one where he says 2CSV and then he passes in the array inside the argument, inside the
Well,
bracket.
we should be clear here. This actually has nothing to do with a singleton method. It does happen to be a singleton method because it's a class, but that's really just a way to call the call method, which you could put on a regular object and inherit. You could inherit call from a class instead of a singleton class and call it with this dot approach. And I personally like this dot approach, but I never use it because I feel like no one else really likes it. And I think what I've heard people say is that it's too easy to overlook the dot, whereas dot call is much easier to see when you're reading the code. I basically never use this dot approach because I've noticed that no one else really likes it, so I just don't use it at all. But yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I think it's a substitute for calling dot call, but it's not actually. There's nothing important here about it being. You could do this without using singleton methods, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It happens to be a singleton method, but that's not the important part here.
Okay. So I think I'm going to cover the next two sections and then we discuss at once. So the next part is about determining the appropriate size for your library. And then he says that when designing your library, it is important that you at least have an idea of how large the library is going to be. And now he goes into an example whereby instead of having your library like in the first section whereby you have an enumerable and you're turning it into CSV output, you now want to extend that library such that it can handle other transformations. For example, you want to handle other objects such as you're converting enumerables into maybe Word tables or Excel spreadsheets or PDFs. So he tells you to look at it from that lens whereby the initial library was kind of meant to have a smaller scope, but then you want to the second form of the library has like a larger scope whereby you're handling all these transformations. So he says that small libraries in general tend to be significantly less flexible than large libraries. And then he gives an example here that was very hard for me to understand because it didn't include any snippets of code. So I think I'll just read. So he says, let's say you have an enumerable CSV library all over your application with 100 different reports in CSV format. And then one day you get a new requirement. All places in the application that offer CSV reports must now offer PDF reports and Excel equivalents with the same information. So in a large framework that supports different output adapters, this may be just a keyword argument that needs to be switched. And depending on how you structured your application, you might need to change that keyword argument in 100 places or in a single place if that's the only place in the application where I used it. But at the end of the day, this change is based around the fact that it's a keyword argument that has to change. And then on the other hand, if you have a small enumerable to CSV library, if you have to make such a change, you have to scramble to find a large library that handles both PDF and Excel and likely end up replacing your usage of the small library with the large library since it supports everything all at once. And then he says that it's possible to be wrong about the expected size of your library and still be successful. And he gives an example whereby you think your library is going to have tons of features and multiple input and input converters and output adapters, but then you only implement the enumerable input converter and CSV output adapter because that's what you need at the moment. So if you end up having all these multiple input converters and output adapters, but then at the end you find out that you don't really need them and you're only using the enumerable to CSV output adapter, then you can get rid of all that complexity by refactoring the library to only have the input converter and CSV output adapter which you're actually using. And then he gives an example here whereby for a simple library you can have two CSV and then you pass in the array, but then the same functionality can be achieved with a large library by now having a two CSV method, and inside that method we define where the input comes from and where each output we are returning, and then for each of these methods we are passing in the type of input, and then we are also passing in the type of output that we require. So that kind of syntax could be part of a larger library that you might end up swapping um, for your smaller library, which handles enumerable to CSV output. So now we move on to handling complexity trade-offs during method design. So he states that you have a choice of how many methods you should have in your library, and he refers to the single responsibility principle, which was covered in chapter 2. This is part of the solid design approach or chapter that we covered in chapter 2. And he says that to implement the same exact features, you can either use fewer but more complex and more flexible methods, or you can use more methods that are less complex and less flexible. So he presents a problem here whereby you want to do a couple of things as part of your data access library. And here you want to be able to retrieve the first record, the first n, or the first number of records as an array. And in this case, n could be any number. So you can say something like the first 10 records or the first 20 records, and as you're retrieving them as an array. And then the first record matching a given criteria, the first n records matching a given criteria, still n can be substituted with any number from, like, I imagine 1 to infinity. You can say the first 10 records matching a given criteria return to me as an array. And then the record at offset 0, n number of records starting at offset 0 still return to you as an array. So the idea is that for each of these ways in which you want to access the data, you can choose to write a method that is specific to each of them. And you're going to end up having so many methods. Um, and what I mean by that is that the methods are going to be very many in number. So to return the first record, you're going to have a first record method. And then for the first n, or the first defined number of records, you can have the first underscore n records, and then you pass in the n as the number of records you want to be returned to you. And then to get the first matching record, still that has its own method related to it, and so on and so forth. So each of those use cases has its own method. And then the next section talks about the alternative approach, whereby instead of having so many methods, you now refactor that to use fewer methods, with each of these methods being more complex internally. And as you can see, we have a first record method that where you pass in the offset, and then a record at offset method whereby still we pass in the offset, and then a first n records, still we are passing in the n, which is the number of records we want, and then the offset, and so on and so forth. So he states that as a library maintainer, which implementation approach would you prefer to maintain? And second, as a library user, which interface would you prefer to use? And by interface here, he's referring to either the approach which uses very many methods, or the approach which uses fewer, more complex methods. And he says that in terms of maintenance, there's a clear advantage in combining each method requiring an offset and a method not allowing an offset into a single method that accepts an optional offset. So yeah, the rest of the section, he literally does that. He refactors and refactors until a point whereby you have the least number of methods that achieve the same thing, but keeping in mind that these methods are going to be more complex compared to the ones we started out with. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Though I didn't quite understand which approach he prefers, because I don't think he mentioned it. He talks about it in kind of like and it depends kind of point of view, whereby depending on what you prefer as a maintainer or what you prefer as a user, you can choose either approaches or either approach. And yeah.
I think what he ends up with. Can you scroll up a little bit? The to the examples that list all the yes, those use cases for all the different types of things. I think what he ends up with here is very elegant. As an end user, it makes sense to me, and it's very powerful, very flexible in the API use. The path to get here was like there was a lot of work to get here. You know,
Yeah.
there were implementations that were simpler implementations that lived in their own methods and that didn't take into account the any of the other functionality. Um, and like partly what I want to say is that you know we got to this because the requirements are sort of static now. Um, you know the like a lot of times you know when you're working on something you get a single requirement you know you would get like the first um, example of that thing and then more features need to be added and more features need to be added and sometimes it's hard to know when to sit down and do a large refactor to normalize and create an elegant API when you have sort of this endless stream of new requirements and new functionality that needs to be added and it's unclear if you're even going to be able to create an elegant API like you see here. So sometimes it's hard to even find the time or know that like it's important to put in the time to refactor because there it can be more elegant.
Maybe a question I have about this kind of refactoring that he ends up with. So when you look at this method, yeah, there's this rule that I think it was Sandy Metz that came up with it. The rule of a method can be no longer than 5 lines. Doesn't this method deviate from that rule? And also, is that rule meant to be like, should it be followed literally, or there are cases whereby you can break the rule if need be? Because
So
when I
this,
look at the number of lines, there are way more than the 5 lines, which is the cutoff according to that rule.
yeah, in the last chapter, the author expressed his philosophy on this, which is very different. This author's philosophy is if you refactor this method because it's longer than 5 lines, you will make the code base worse. It doesn't mean you can't refactor this method, and it doesn't mean you can't make it less than 5 lines. That could be the right thing to do, but if the reason you're doing it is because it's more than 5 lines, then you're going to make the code worse. So regardless of what, did you say Sandy Metz?
Yeah.
Regardless of what his philosophy is, assuming that we're understanding it correctly. So sometimes
Oh,
people have these rules. Yeah, sometimes
mm,
people have these rules, and then you discover later that they didn't mean for those rules to be applied dogmatically. But
mm.
regardless, this author not only thinks you shouldn't apply those rules dogmatically, but he strongly feel it was like the only objective, like the last chapter, everything was subjective, but he only made one point that he felt was objective, which was specifically if you make this less than 5 lines for the sake of making it less than 5 lines, you will make the code worse. So regardless of whether you agree with that or not, just pointing out the author absolutely positively would say, no, you do not have to refactor this to get it down below 5 lines. You can, but you're not obligated to do that.
Or maybe another thing, if I remember correctly, I feel like this method would be flagged by Robocop as well. At least for the projects I've worked on, they have that five lines rule set in like as part of their Robocop CI. So if you write this method, it will be flagged by Robocop.
Yeah, the author in the last chapter said turn all of those rules off. Like the author said, every single complexity metric, Rubocop rule of any sort, that should all be turned off. In fact, the author went so far as to say turn all of the rules off and enable them one by one. But the author would never. So this author on any of this author's personal projects or this author's projects where they're a leader of the project, he would never turn on any of those metrics Rubocop rules. So even though you're seeing them in a lot of projects, this author's projects, you would not get a RuboCop violation in this author's projects for this.
And I think that's partly because this author is an expert, right? When you're first starting
Yeah.
out, you don't know you don't know any guidelines really. And sometimes as you're starting out, it's good to see like, oh, maybe this is a consideration that I should have. I didn't even think that it should be a consideration, but RuboCop is suggesting it, so maybe it's a good idea. And as you get more senior, you start to realize, or you start to understand when it's a good idea to break the rules because you have picked up the signals that tell you, okay, like, no, in this case, I really want to be more performant, or use less memory, or I don't want to include unnecessary abstraction for some for this code because there's no reason to, and so you start to break some of those rules. But I think a lot of those guidelines are more effective when you're just starting out, and then as you gain more experience and you uh, learn more of these edge cases and criteria about when the rules are good and when they're not so good, um, you start to need them less and less. And I would expect that an expert in the field would not need any RuboCop rules to set them on the right path, and that they would only turn on the rules that you know that they find um, universal or that they want to enforce in their own projects.
Yeah. Maybe my last question about this piece of code. You see how you have an only one variable as part of the arguments he passes in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had never
I've
seen this
never
before.
seen this. Yeah.
Me neither.
Yeah.
So
I was
I took a
surprised.
note of that. Yeah, I took a note of that too because I had never seen this before. So I don't know if that means I'll use it someday, but I had no idea you could do this.
I feel like I might because it just looks so cool.
Isn't it?
I
Isn't
think
it like
that
a variable? Is variable the right name for it?
so
It's
here's the way I normally do handle this situation. I would default number to nil, and then in the body of the method, I would set only name to 1 if number is nil. Which is still a little bit different because that the behavior would be different because that wouldn't handle the situation where nil was explicitly passed in. But yeah, basically, what this code is saying is or what I believe it's saying is, if the number keyword argument is not provided, set a local variable called only1 to 1. So there's going to be a local variable called only1, and it's going to be set to 1 if no number keyword argument is given. And or at least that's what I'm assuming this is doing.
yeah.
I could be wrong, but that seems like the only sensible thing for it to do. But
That's
I just had no clue.
Mhm. Sorry, yeah, that's what it's doing, and number becomes 1 as well. I'm thinking that's because that's what the expression evaluates to. So only 1 is set to 1, and number is set to 1 as well. So I feel
Oh,
like
I didn't catch.
yeah, he could have
Yeah, I
just
didn't catch that part.
done, yeah, he could have just done the check in the end. If you scroll down a bit, Newton, to do
Yeah.
something like if something like number equals 1 or something like that, and to just up a bit.
Oh, it was at the top of the page. Yeah, he does a ternary operator on it at the very top. So go down to the next page. It's at the top of 199, I think.
Oh, so yeah.
Yeah.
So it seemed like the only purpose for this variable is to avoid checking if number equals 1.
So I wonder if what he's doing is we need to know if the user expects an array as the result or a regular or a not like one value, but not an array. Like imagine, and maybe this is actually part of the active record interface. I can't remember, but let's say you could pass an array of primary keys to find, and it would return to you an array of records, which might actually be how it works. Versus if you passed in one primary key, then you would just get one record back. Well, you need a way to know what kind of return type the user is expecting, and it might be that's what they're using this for. Because first record doesn't return an array, but
exactly.
But you need to know the difference between they want the first record or they want the first one records as an array. So if you passed in number 1 as an explicit number, you'll get an array with one item in it, which is what the user expects. But if you leave number out entirely, you'll just get the object, not an array containing the object.
Wait, interesting. I didn't think about that. So if you set number explicitly to 1, then you would return an array of one
Right.
item.
Exactly. Just like if and that would be what the user would expect, because imagine you're like iterating. Like let's imagine the number of records to return is like a local variable that's an integer. And that integer might be 2 or it might be 1. Well, you want to get an array regardless. You don't want to get an array when I is 2, but a non-array when I equals 1. That wouldn't make sense. So it's like, it seems like it's important that if the number of records is passed in, you get an array back so that you don't break calling code. But if you're just trying to get the first record and that's all you're trying to do, then you don't want an array with one record in it.
Then I'm surprised. Doesn't the requirement change? First record. What did first record return? I feel like it was just a number and not a number in an array.
You know, an interesting thing here is that I don't know if the requirements. He's like changing the interface, but I don't know if the requirements are supposed to be directly interpreted as the interface itself. Actually, I have a lot to say just about interface versus implementation here, but yeah, let me go. I'm going to try to find the requirements.
Okay. First record is supposed to return a number, which is the direct return value of calling like next record, like the data API.
Yeah. So first record goes back to the beginning and just gives you the next record, which will be the first record.
Yeah, and it's not an array. So
it's not an array. So I think, but the thing to point out here is that so he doesn't break that though, because if you call the other one without passing number in, you don't get an array. So the interface is changing, but the behavior is meeting the requirements.
So wouldn't this be a little bit confusing to the user at first, at least?
You know, I think that's kind of subjective too, and comes down to like the interface design. And I don't even know if the author is pointing out which interface is superior here. He kind of leaves it up to the reader to choose what to do. I actually get a little bit confused. I get a little bit confused here because here's like the main thought I have. If I were writing this code, I would start to see the similar pieces of code in these various methods. And I actually would introduce a private method. So I would probably have a private method called seek that takes a number and resets and calls next record that number of times just to get me to the right offset whenever I need to. But it would be a private method. It would be a private method because it has nothing to do with the actual interface requirements. And so one thing I'm wondering is that it feels like you could implement the API with the complicated flexible behavior by having a bunch of smaller methods that are private. So that part kind of confused me, because you could have a bunch of simple self-explanatory methods with simple APIs, or you could have a small number of methods with complicated APIs But then if you encapsulate all that behavior into smaller private methods, you get a bunch of, one way or the other, you wind up with a bunch of small methods. So I was kind of confused about that. I felt like there was almost a conflation, and conflation is not the right word, but almost a conflation between implementation and interface while reading this. Like, here's an example. One thing you could do is just implement this with the flexible API, then make that API completely private. Now it's no longer really an API, it's implementation detail, and then implement all of those self-explanatory methods as
Yeah,
public methods that those could call the flexible underneath API that's now private. So you could do both implementations, and technically both interfaces, and pick and choose which one you want. I have one other thought, and I can't remember what it was about this. Oh, so here's what I think is kind of happening. Here's how I picture this. I feel like this is to a large extent about the public API, and you're kind of deciding between switching on method names or switching on argument values or presence. So in either way, you're branching behavior, and you're making a decision about whether the programmer that's using the library is expressing how to branch through the code through method names or through argument structure and value. And then you were asking, Sam, well, which one would you prefer? And I kind of feel like the author doesn't even answer that. And it could be kind of subjective. So it kind of almost all comes down to that. Do you want the calling code to express itself through method name or through arguments, or somewhere on the spectrum between the two? Like, what feels good and right,
Yeah. I feel like the author already addressed my concern when he renames the what method does he rename? He uses an alias for first, right? He uses first for like first end records and stuff like that to make the interface simpler. Because he said that it would look weird to call like first end method without an argument to get like either a single record or to pass an argument and get an array. And so he further like simplifies that using an alias that has like a clearer intent. I feel like in the that's on page 200.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
no, it still doesn't choose for us, but I feel like that clears it up a bit. Because I didn't know that I was confused until you asked that question. I didn't realize the nuance in the only one variable usage there.
Actually,
Yeah,
to that, I actually forgot about this, but I took a note that was when he writes this library the first time, I actually didn't understand what he was getting at. It was on page 196 where then it became more obvious to me what the author was getting at. But from page 192 to 195, like I enjoyed looking at the code, but I actually did not know what point the author was trying to make. It wasn't until like page 196 that I was able to start making sense of what the author was. So you were kind of mentioning that this alias here on the last page kind of highlighted some stuff. I actually felt like page 196 highlighted a lot of the things between page 192 and 195. And I don't know if that was just like bad reading comprehension on my part. But when I first read page 192 to 195, I wasn't
yeah,
exactly sure. I wasn't exactly sure why the author was explaining any of this stuff. It wasn't until 196 in the contrast that I started to get it.
I see. Yeah, when I read that part, like 192 to 95, I think, I was just following along, like, okay, where does this lead? Because these look like simple methods, just like the title says, one method to handle each case. So I was waiting already because I could see some similarities. I was waiting for a sort of mix, a combination of methods to have like fewer, and that's what he did. So it's probably maybe just based on what you were expecting from the author. But I didn't really have any. I think I was just following along nicely until the later parts, maybe 198 and so on. Yeah, I think it makes more sense to call first, no argument, and you get a single record. And
Mhm.
when you're passing, yeah, anything to number, then you get an array. But it might still be confusing at first, but then I think the user will get quickly get used to the difference. Because if you're passing number one, not realizing that you could just not pass anything at all, you get a different object, an array instead of
Yeah.
an integer. And that might trip you up at first. I feel like it might trip me up personally, but I'll get used to
Well,
it.
I think there's other ways the author could have. There's other aspects of the inner. Like I feel like number is not even the greatest name for that keyword. I don't know what I would call it. Maybe limit or quantity. Limit would like communicate to me. Anyone with SQL knowledge would immediately know what number is going for. But yeah, yeah, and I guess to some extent the author's not trying to make the perfect interface. They're kind of trying to show you differences between interface choices. Um,
True.
yeah, I did get confused, or I was kind of confused about the private method thing I mentioned earlier. So like where it's like fewer but more complex methods.
Yeah.
Like I was saying earlier, you could reload. You could take a complex method and make it simple by moving its complexity elsewhere. So I was still confused about that. Like the behavior. So the behavior is more complicated and the interface is more complicated, but whether or not the method is complicated is kind of a decision of how you want to decompose or not decompose that complexity.
Yeah. What do you think about the last part of page 200 after the first the code examples where he renamed them to first, where he says like the alternative approach would be to have 8 methods. I feel like that's what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, actually, you're right. Yeah. I forgot about that. I think the problem is that by that point, I had already formed my confusion or whatever or thoughts about the chapter. So I guess you're
Yeah.
right. He did get to that point. And it's also interesting that he names the private method with an underscore at the front, which I do sometimes and sometimes I don't. I'm kind of curious if the author does that consistently or not. Because I've actually not seen that approach in a book before, putting an underscore at the beginning of a private method. I see it a lot in JavaScript, but I don't usually see it in Ruby private methods. But yeah, you're right. That very last bit of the book does actually address my concerns or whatever, but I kind of forgot about that at this point, and I had already kind of formed. I guess I had already had a strong first impression by that point.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So a lot of like if this is intended to be a library, a lot of this misunderstanding or understanding or clarity is in the documentation, because there's never a point where I'm just like digging into the code for some external library to see how it works. The first place where I see how it works is the documentation, and if the documentation is well written, then I want to use that library more, or if it's simple to understand, it seems to me like it might be a better library to use than one that is hard to understand or has a lot of moving parts or a lot of. I mean, this is a personal preference, but I do prefer a library that is easier to remember. And for me, the library where they it's one method. It's more complex because there's more arguments to pass, but those arguments have meaningful names, and through experimentation, I can find out what they do. it's a lot easier to discover than it would be to try to remember distinct names for each of those operations.
Yeah, I feel you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's weird because like one note I took is that a lot of times for these types of libraries, I'm actually copying and pasting prior art from elsewhere in the code base, which in those cases, it makes the interface not matter quite as much. But then also now what you just said, Nelson, has me thinking about things like how good is the auto completion in your tooling, and does it handle like, because different people are going to have different tooling, and I wonder if some people might rather see, you know, 8 different methods with self-explanatory names and just hit the down arrow like 3 times and hit enter, but some other engineers might rather be like, I know, because there's only one method, I already know its name, and now I just need to figure out which arguments I want to pass to it. So I wonder if even tooling is going to give different engineers different experiences with these different APIs.
Makes sense. I wanted to show a page or just an example of the documentation for Rodoth by Jeremy Evans. I could share a link because I wanted to show that for that kind of documentation, we rarely see examples for how to use each method. We just get like a short text description of like what it is and what it does, and so it trips me up a lot. And I find that um, I have to read the source code a number of times for Rodolph, or just just look elsewhere to get like an understanding. So I don't know what the author's preference is. I feel like the author would like to use uh, 8 different methods and have like just looking at some of his stuff. I'm not very sure, but like Nelson said, I'd prefer really nice documentation with examples so that I can always like
Yeah,
Well, I
go to
mean,
that.
I prefer.
Jeremy Evans is like his consider a lot of what he does is very, very performant code. And as we discovered or we read about earlier, when you have more arguments, it takes longer to call that method, and simpler methods with 0 arguments are the fastest. I mean, for him, I could understand that you want the performance benefit of these separate methods that have as few arguments as possible.
That makes sense. I think he mentions in this chapter that we're assuming performance is not a requirement, and that's why we're doing all these combinations of methods with like longer argument lists and stuff. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also first of all, I also prefer the one method approach that's given here. I also don't really think about performance much when choosing between interfaces. So that is something that I see the author thinking about certainly more than I ever do, especially since I'm using Ruby in the first place. Like, but anyway, yeah. Another random thought is that I might actually just naturally, organically start off with the 8 different methods with self-documenting names, and then at a later time, and Nelson was mentioning earlier, like, do you want to set aside time to improve an interface or not? This might actually be like in a lot of my code, like an evolution where I start off with the 8 different methods with self-explanatory names, then at a later time I refactor it into one or 2 methods with flexible behavior revolving around its argument types. So it might be that I kind of have to just like discover what a good API is as like a journey.
Yeah, I think that's probably the safest way to go about it, so that you don't prematurely optimize. And I feel like like Nelson was saying earlier, it's not a static set of requirements. It's growing as you're exploring, what you're solving and how you're solving it. So maybe when it settles, when it starts to settle, is when you can really go back and try to fuse different methods together and stuff. But I think it makes sense. I would also start out with simpler simpler methods like the author showed.
Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it for today. We should maybe say who'll take up chapter 8, and this is it. It's about designing for extensibility.
Mm.
It seems pretty short as well, so we can just cover